Good evening, folks. How's everybody doing tonight? Good. Can y'all hear me okay? Awesome. Thank you. My name is Sarah Grummett. I'm part of the team that puts these Café events together, and we are really excited to see all of you here this evening. We'd like to start by thanking our sponsors, PPG, and of course, the contributions from our amazing audience members, such as yourselves. We really hope that you will come back and join us next month for our next great talk, and hopefully bring a couple of friends. If you don't have any friends, maybe you can bring your enemies. Either way, bring your dog. It'll be great. I'll just remind everybody that we will have a Q&A after the session. And there is also this evening an opportunity to purchase Dr. Neil Bockoven's books at the table up there. And I believe Dr. Bockoven will be signing them as well. And for the folks who are joining us online tonight, if you are interested in purchasing a book, you can hop on over to Amazon. For our online audiences, there is a Q&A button that you'll see on your screen, which you can use to submit your questions. And it is my honor to introduce Dr. Neil Bockoven. Dr. Bockoven is an award-winning PhD geologist, journalist, and author who earned his doctorate in geoscience from the University of Texas at Austin. His current interests center on the interaction between early modern humans and Neanderthals during the Paleolithic age and the amazing related discoveries being made through archaeology and ancient DNA analysis. Neil has been a featured speaker all over the USA. His Facebook page has 25,000 followers, and by posting on other pages, he reaches 4,500,000 followers weekly. In addition to his two novels, Mock 2 and the Mammoth People and The People Eaters, he has also published a related children's science book titled When We Met Neanderthals. And now please give a warm round of applause for Dr. Neil Bockoven.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for that nice introduction. Good evening, everyone. The mic is on, isn't it? Can you guys hear me? No. I turned it on. It's on. Can you guys hear me now? Better? Okay. Well, again, thanks for that nice introduction, and good evening, everybody. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about paleo cave art, which is just a fascinating and really huge topic. And I'll also say a few words about 3 books I've recently written, which are all about what happened when we, early modern humans, met up with Neanderthals in Europe about 45,000 years ago, which we know happened. 2 of the books are novels that are getting great reviews, and the third is a children's science book that's been strongly endorsed by the head of the anthropology department at Texas A&M. So on to our topic tonight, cave art. I'm going to be showing some really amazing pictures, but what's really cool, and I think more important, is to know the stories and the science behind the images, what we're learning from all this. Like, when did humans start making art? What's the oldest art on various continents? Who made it, and what did it mean? And why we're convinced that most cave art has been unfortunately destroyed, and how some of what remains gives us the very first images of volcanoes, landscapes, stars, hunting instructions, and directions for rituals, sometimes involving hallucinogens. And the pictures of the handprints that show up on so many caves. Here's a guy who's promising you the most intense emotion you've ever experienced when you see them. Well, I wouldn't go that far, but they do have a profound impact on us. But what are they telling us? I think you're going to find this interesting. So let me set the stage. Look, Papa, oxen. With those words, the wonderful paintings at Altamira Cave in Spain were discovered by 8-year-old Maria Satuola in 1879. Mr. Satuola had earlier visited the Paris Expo, where he was intrigued by an exhibit of prehistoric tools and small art objects that have been found in some of the French caves. After discussing excavation techniques with the exhibit's experts, he returned to explore the caves around his home in Cantabria, Spain. He was busy digging in the floor of Altamira Cave while his playful daughter ran in and out of the cave. Well, no one had yet recognized the antiquity of this cave art, with most of it being attributed to the Romans. It was Satuola who first proposed the extreme age of the art, and for that, he was roundly criticized. And because of the beauty and sophistication of the art and the lack of soot on the cave walls, he was even accused of forgery. It turns out Altamira's artists probably used bone marrow fat to light their cave, which limited the soot. It was 1902 before the antiquity of the art was generally accepted, but Satuola never got to enjoy his accomplishment, having died 14 years earlier. But in 1879, hard at work digging in the cave's floor, Satuola burst out laughing when his daughter pointed out the paintings he'd almost missed. It makes me wonder how many cases like that I've had in my life. I guess we all wonder about that kind of thing. And it also reminds me of Newton's famous quote, "I don't know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, diverting myself in now and then, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." Along those lines, let me show you something that was found in an Alabama cave recently and just published on this past year. This is the image of a low karsted ceiling in a northern Alabama cave. You don't see much there, right? But using high resolution 3D photogrammetry and more than 14,000 photos, researchers have been able to tease out hundreds, perhaps thousands of faint engravings of wasps and coiled serpents and birds and human-like figures in elaborate regalia. It turns out this is the most prolific, this is the most important, the biggest cave art site in North America. And we just found it recently, just published on last year. Some of the images are 11 feet in length, again, some of the largest in North America. And because the cave ceiling is only about 2 or 3 feet tall, the researchers and the artists had to lie on their backs to see most of these images. It's exciting to me that bringing new technologies like this to bear may allow us to see previously unrecognized images in caves throughout the world. It's amazing what we may have been missing. Well, we all know that much of cave art can be breathtakingly beautiful. According to some reports, after visiting Altamira, a blown-away Picasso exclaimed, "After Altamira, all is decadence." But tonight I'm going to tell you many of the facts behind the cave art, including many of the superlatives. Like, what is the oldest art that was found in a cave? This is the Makapansgat cobble. It's a roughly 3-inch by 3-inch cobble of red jasper that looks remarkably like a human head. It was collected as is by a pre-human almost 3 million years ago. and transported 20 miles to a cave, a dolomite cave that has no jasper. That's how we know it's the oldest manuport we've ever found. And some have called it the it-me cobble because it's the earliest sign of self-recognition in hominids. The oldest works of art that were made in a cave used to be handprints, 226,000-year-old handprints made very purposefully by children, probably Denisovan or Neanderthal children in Tibet. I say used to be because hashtag markings found in the Rising Star Cave were likely made by Homo naledi. And if they were, they're almost certainly more than 250,000 years old. It's interesting that the hashtag art there is very similar to the hashtag art found in Gibraltar made by Neanderthals. And let me tell you, I just read an article about that art there. That took between 200 and 300 scrapings. It wasn't done haphazardly. And then it's also similar to hashtag art found made by we Homo sapiens in another South African cave. But getting back to this one, these hashtags are very close to where Homo naledi have been found apparently buried in shallow pits. And if these are burials, they predate the oldest Homo sapien burial, that being one in modern day Israel that dates to about 100,000 years. They predate that one by 2 or 3 times as old. All of this by a human with a brain about a third size of ours, about a brain about the size of an orange. Wow. Well, moving on. How about all those handprints? We find them in caves all over the world. These being from the Cueva de las Manos in Argentina that date to as old as 13,000 years ago. What we found here is that most of these handprints and many of the handprints elsewhere were made by women. And the way you tell that is on women, the index finger and the ring finger are the same length. With men, the ring finger is generally longer. It works about 70% of the time. And I usually have to pause while everybody checks their fingers out now. So that brings up the question, what about the art nearby that's our woolly rhinoceroses and deer and caves and rhinos and horses and bison? Were those made by women as well? Well, a number of research papers are suggesting that. So that's a pretty cool new finding. The oldest painting made in a cave is a red hand stencil made by a Neanderthal at least 64,000 years ago. This one that I'm going to show you now is in a very nearby cave, and it dates to almost the exact same, not quite as old, but just about. And it's incredibly complex. Some people have tried to figure out what you see here, but tell me what that is. I mean, I can't figure it out. But these images predate the arrival of we Homo sapiens into Europe by 10 to 20,000 years. Elsewhere in another Spanish cave, perforated red and yellow pigmented shells have been found made by Neanderthals that date to an astounding 115,000 years, much older than the similar artifacts made by us in South Africa or in Africa or anywhere else in the world. So together, these artifacts and the art refute the idea that Neanderthal art was primitive or lacking in comparison to ours. And it totally blows out of the water the idea that Neanderthals only made their art after seeing us and imitating us. It turns out Neanderthals were probably a lot more like us than we used to believe, and they may have been ahead of us in some regards. The oldest representational art made by us, made by Homo sapiens, is found in Indonesia in an Indonesian cave. It's of a warty pig that dates to more than 45,000 years old. There have been more than 400 caves in Europe have been found that contain prehistoric art. It does seem to be the richest area, but that may be a function of better preservation or more investigators looking there. A search of worldwide distributions of cave art led me to find mostly Eurocentric maps. But we know there's been a ton of cave art and prehistoric art made in Australia, the Americas. I mean, we just talked about the Alabama case, in Africa and elsewhere, and we're going to talk a lot about that later in this talk. It used to be thought that cave art got more sophisticated and better through time. Chauvet Cave in France blew that idea out of the water. It may be the most important cave art site in the world. Just imagine the thrill. It was 1994, not that long ago, when Elliot Brunel chipped through a stalactite, crawled through a very narrow opening, shined her light, and exclaimed to her two friends outside, "They've been here." Inside the cave were hundreds of works of exceptional beauty and sophistication. It's hard to make the case that any other cave measures up to this one with as many amazing attributes. Number one, it's the oldest representational art made by Homo sapiens in Europe, dating to at least 37,000 years ago. It's the best preserved or among the best preserved because of the collapse of the cave entrance 26,000 years ago. The exceptional beauty and sophistication of the art. I mean, look at that horse. That just blows my mind. The beauty just is amazing. And not only did they draw exceptionally sophisticated images, they imparted the suggestion of movement by using irregularities in the cave walls to look like 3D, and by etching around some of the animals. And in the case of this rhino, drawing 7 different horns on it. Imagine seeing that in a flickering torchlight. Well, Chauvet also has, last year, Ellefson proposed that the lion panel, some of which you see here, and see the superposition of these animals, that gives us a suggestion of movement as well. Ellefson suggested that there were elements in the lion panel that represent the very first landscape ever drawn. Near and dear to my heart, being a geologist, Callaway in 2016 gave evidence of what is likely the oldest volcano ever drawn, which were active in the Bas-Viveros range 20 miles north of Chauvet. And they were strombolian in nature with mild but very firework-like sprays of white and red cinders shooting up 1,000 feet into the air. They were active from 35,000 years ago to 29. So we know people were there at the time. We know the eruptions would have been easily visible by people from the hills around Chauvet. And we have these images, pictures of hills with spray-like designs of white coming out that have been overprinted by later artists with some animal pictures. If these are pictures of volcanoes, they predate the next oldest known image of a volcano made by humans by almost 30,000 years. Moreover, in Chauvet, there are almost 200 fossil cave bear skulls have been found. And probably the coolest thing of all, they have found 150 feet of fossilized footprints of where a youth and his or her wolf dog walked together and paused together 26,000 years ago. It's the oldest clear evidence of canine domestication anywhere in the world. There's just so much to love about this cave. Okay, but what about the symbols? What are they telling us? Von Petzinger, in her recent book, First Signs, said there were 32 symbols that were replicated in caves all over the world. And a lot of these are symbols that you might expect to be replicated, like X's. You know, it's hard to make that different. But some of them, like this dented rectangle, 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 rectangle. She doesn't really know what all these mean, or really any of them. She thinks they could be directions to hunting locations. They could be names of beasts or of people. They could be religious symbols. It's unlikely we're ever going to know. But just this year, an article was published by Bacon and others that made a very strong case that the dots and lines we see around some of the animals, 4 dots there, 3 lines there, 3 dots there, 4 dots there, represent the number of lunar months from the start of spring, when the ice broke up on the rivers, to when the animals were mating. Or if there's a Y involved, 2 lines coming down to 1, when they were giving birth. As such, I mean, that's important information for hunters of the day. And as such, it's the oldest writing or proto-writing in the world. One of the coolest things about the Ben Bacon story is that Ben Bacon is not an anthropologist. He's a London furniture conservator who got interested in the subject, collected almost 700 images, like this very pregnant horse with a foursome up here and another odd foursome there, and did a lot of research on mating habits and migration habits and birthing habits and so forth, and took his theory to Paul Pettit, a wonderful archaeologist, and Paul and some other archaeologists helped him write the paper, and they gave Ben Bacon top billing, which I appreciate. Now, Jean Clotes is a French anthropologist that has written more than 300 papers on paleo cave art and 20 books. And he believes that much of paleo cave art was made by shamans that were either under the influence of hallucinogens or they were oxygen starved, and they were trying to get closer to the spirit world. Well, a number of anthropologists have been critical of his work, but just one second. But HIDAR, just 2 years ago in a recent paper, HIDAR did an exhaustive study that found, yes, indeed, much of cave art is in remote, out-of-the-way nooks and crannies in caves that would have given hypoxia, which doctors tell us gives us a rush of dopamine that the shamans may have considered getting them closer to the spirit world. And elsewhere, it is absolutely clear that hallucinogens were involved. In California, you might expect it to be in California, 400-year-old wads of datura have been found stuffed in many of the crevices of Pinwheel Cave, along with symbols, many symbols and images of pinwheels on the cave walls. Datura is also known as gypsum weed, and it has two components, atropine and scopolamine, both of which are hallucinogenic. It's no coincidence that the datura flower uncoils into a pinwheel shape. Elsewhere, closer to where I live in Texas, along the Trans-Pecos, Texas-Mexico border, hundreds of caves have been found with colorful symbols and humans and human-like images, like this famous one called the White Shaman mural, that date to an astounding 4,000 years ago. It's clear that those were involved with peyote ceremonies because they found ground up, reformulated 4,000-year-old balls of peyote in some of these caves. But it's unlikely that these were just aimless product of drug parties. Dr. Carolyn Boyd has studied these things for 3 decades now, and she's convinced that many of these were made at the same time and together represent a unified composition, or in her words, a book. And the discovery of underdrawings that were made before the paint was applied helps support that contention. Okay. She says that most of these images in this book were directions for peyote ceremonies and ecological instructions like the effect of rain on plant and animal behavior, all the while weaving myth and spirits into the story. Well, let me tell you about my favorite cave art discovery story of all. It was 1940, and France had been overrun and occupied by the Nazis. 4 local teenage boys were out walking their dog Robot in the woods of southwestern France, and Robot scampered far ahead, and when the boys got to where he'd been, they couldn't find him. Well, a quick search indicated he'd fallen down a deep hole, so 2 of the boys went back to get paraffin lamps so they could go down and rescue their dog. Well, the boys were not only wanting to rescue their dog, but they were excited because they thought the hole might lead to a tunnel to a nearby castle ruin, and they might find treasure. Well, they went down, they rescued their dog, and they did find treasure, but not the kind they expected. The boys had basically fallen from Nazi-occupied France down into the Paleolithic era. What the hole led to a tunnel where they went into a cave that was, why isn't this working? That was covered with colorful images of animals that were no longer around, of bison and horses and lions and so forth. The boys said they ran around like savages, completely crazy, and that in the flickering light, the animals seemed to be moving. Does that sound familiar? Well, what the boys had found were the wonderful images at Lascaux Cave in France. Just some of the most beautiful and finest in all of cave art. Over 600 images in total. You know, before I move on, I think it's important to point out the profound impact that cave art can have on us today. Some years ago, I was lucky to visit Lascaux, and I mean, I expected to be emotionally moved. I'm a geologist and I love this kind of stuff. But everyone in our group, about 20, people from all walks of life, everyone came out of that cave just stunned, just breathless. And it occurred to me that if the cave art could have such a profound impact on us, people who are jaded by incoming bombardment of amazing images from movies and TV and Facebook, if we could be so profoundly moved by the Lascaux cave art, imagine the impact it had on Paleo people of the day. That reminds me of the image of volcanoes. Even today, when we understand volcanoes and know what's causing them, and they still amaze and dazzle us. Just imagine the impact they had on Paleo people of the day. How would they have explained them? It's fascinating to think about. All right. I'm going to come back to the story about the boys at Lascaux, but for now, let me make a warp factor 10 jump to talking about the stars, the stars, the stars, the stars. Probably shouldn't have tried that. The oldest known constellation mentioned in ancient literature is Taurus the Bull. And its most recognizable part is Pleiades. We call them the Seven Sisters. In ancient literature, they're sometimes referred to as having 6 or 7 stars. Pleiades was mentioned in ancient Sumerian, Greek, and Egyptian literature, and even older images on ancient Chinese art, indigenous Australian art, and in some of the Native American Hopi and Navajo Pueblos and Kivas and so forth. Pleiades gets its name from the Greek word to sail, since its arrival in the night sky indicated the sailing season in the Mediterranean. So why am I telling you this? Well, a number of researchers believe that this thing isn't working anymore. A number of researchers believe that Pleiades can be found in some of the Lascaux images. Rappengluck in 2002 made a really strong case that a number of the bulls in Lascaux have Pleiades at their shoulder. By the way, that's where it shows up in our constellation images today. And he thought not only was Pleiades showing up there, but it got its relationship to Taurus the bull 17,000 years ago, or even earlier. Sweatman and Combs in 2018 took this a step farther, and they got software that modeled the night sky 17,000 years ago. And then they compared the stars with what the images that we find in Lascaux, and they found what they said were clear alignments, like the tips of the bull's horns, the eyes, the legs, and Pleiades ever constant on the shoulder of the bull. By the way, at Lascaux, they only show up on the bull, so that pretty well ties in the idea that, yeah, these are Taurus the bull constellation. But they think that many other constellations are represented in the artwork there, and that the ancients were using these things as calendars to predict things like equinoxes and so forth. I haven't been totally sold on that idea yet, but it's not as outrageous a claim as you might think. Using only the same tools available to these people, the Paleolithic people, simple observation, the Aztecs were able to build incredibly sophisticated predictions, star charts and predictions, including predicting eclipses down to the day. So once again, this is leading us toward the conclusion that these Paleolithic cultures may have been more advanced than we used to think. Okay, it's time for you guys to step up to the plate. Here's your quiz. This is an image from Lascaux. So what do you see there? Anybody? Shout it out. Pleiades. Yes. You see Pleiades right up here again on the shoulder of the bull. And what else? The four dots. Either this foursome or this foursome, one or both of those is likely referring to the number of lunar months from when the animals were mating. I mean, from the start of spring to when the animals were mating. So good. Now you guys know and can decipher cave art about as well as anybody in the world. All right. What's not in cave art is also instructive. In his book, The Cave Painters, Curtis, gosh, this thing isn't working. It's driving me nuts. Okay. Curtis mentions these items as being rare or absent in European art. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but note fish at the top and humans at the bottom. And we'll come back to talking about those. But over on the landscape, the trees, flowers, rivers, lakes, cave, and then really odd to me, few, if any, images of the moon or the sun. What's that about? Well, I can't leave the rock art topic without talking about Australian, indigenous Australian art. In Australia, there have been, get this, over 100,000 significant rock art sites identified, with more being found almost every day. This one was just found, at least by non-indigenous folks, in 2006. And it has almost 1,400 images that date from relatively recent to all the way back to 28,000 years ago. A lot of Australian art has images of animals, and there, as many as 80% of their animals are humans. So that's a big difference from European art, where you almost found close to zero humans shown. Here it's about 80%, and other large animals. And they also have a lot of petroglyphs that are circles and spirals and so forth. Anthropologists think that the artists were discussing their cultural beliefs of how they interacted with other humans and large animals in their culture. On a sad note, most cave art has been unfortunately destroyed. And some of that has been by vandalism and cave collapse and mining activities and so forth. But the great bulk of the destruction has come from sea level rise. In the last 20,000 years, sea levels have risen 400 feet. And that has inundated prehistoric sites and caves and land areas, totaling that together add up to the size of South America. So most humans tend to live near oceans or lower river valleys where the game and food is plentiful. So it's unfortunate that so many sites have been likely destroyed. One really good example of that is Cosquer Cave in France, which used to be well above sea level, but today its entrance is over 100 feet below sea level. And much of the cave, over 50% of the cave, has been inundated, but what remains has almost 500 images in it. And this answers one of the other oddities that we mentioned earlier. Why aren't there any fish shown or sea animals? Well, Cosquer Cave, being near to the shore, one of the coastal caves, has pictures of fish and seals and this odd thing that looks like a penguin that's called an auk. And it has some horses and other animals shown as well. So it's likely that where those food sources were important, they showed up, but most of those caves have been swamped. It's sad to me to think about all the wonderful images that we're never going to see because of the inundation by the water, but I think it also helps underscore why we should cherish what remain that much more. Okay, finally, I'll end this part of the presentation coming back to the story about the boys at Lascaux. Shortly after the discovery, the one Jewish boy of the four teenagers was rounded up by the Nazis, and he and his parents were shipped to Buchenwald. Luckily, the French Red Cross was able to rescue Simon Koenkas, the boy, because he was under the age of 16. But his parents weren't as lucky. They perished in the camp. I think it's a really powerful juxtaposition of here's a person who saw the worst of humanity and perhaps the best. Simon's probably the only person to have ever witnessed the horrors of Nazi genocide and yet discovered the artistic beauty of the Paleolithic age. And I'm dedicating this presentation to Simon and his family. Well, that's what I have for you today. Before I finish, let me say a few words about my books. Oh, this thing isn't working. Okay. Two of the books are novels that are getting great reviews. This is The People Eaters, the most recent one out. And I won't go through those, but you can, on the backs of the books, you can read these as well. But these are power hitters. Joseph DePrisco is the head of a new literary project. They give out a $50,000 prize to up-and-coming writers every year. Kathleen and Michael Gear have sold almost 20 million books of their series. And I also love the idea of being compared to Jean Aul, Clan of the Cave Bear, and her series that sold more than 50 million copies. She has, by the way, written me a letter saying she was pleased by my books. So they're getting really good reviews, not only from literary critics, but from Pat Shipman and other anthropologists. She's written 10 books in anthropology, very high-powered anthropologist. Mach 2, both Mach 2 and the Mammoth People and the People Eaters are just backed by the best and most up-to-date science I could find. Each one has about 100 annotated references at the back of the book that speak to the authenticity of everything you're going to be reading about in the books. But I don't want you to get the idea that these are science books. They're just good, fun reads that are full of action and adventure and sex and violence and drama and love stories, all the good stuff. And so I hope you'll check those out. This is a similar Again, similar thing on Mach 2. You can see compared to Gene Aul's Clan of the Cave Bear, and then down at the bottom, I've gotten more than 30 reviews, unbiased Amazon Vine reviewers. They don't know me, I don't know them, and they can be brutal, and yet they've ranked it 4.8 stars out of 5 with comments like, I think Bockoven could be the new Aul, was blown away, an awesome, awesome book, absolutely brilliant, really good reviews. So I hope you'll check those out. Now, the children's science book has been strongly endorsed by the head of the anthropology department at Texas A&M. It's a colorful picture story of what may have happened when we met up with Neanderthals in Europe so long ago. And each page has a science corner fact on it, like this one. This is the oldest undisputed musical instrument that's ever been found, a more than 40,000-year-old vulture bone flute found in Germany. The book has pictures of saber-toothed cats and volcanoes and mammoths and woolly rhinos, and kids are loving it. It's getting 4.2 stars out of 5 from the Amazon Vine folks, and then it's gotten really good comments. And a woman sent me this picture. She said she gave it to her grandchildren, and they loved it. They read it 4 times that day. It's their favorite book. And I will just point out that Christmas is only 49 days away. And then the last 2 pages of the book now this one ain't working. Why isn't this working? Let me go up. Well, I don't need to go to the next slide. Well, yes, I do. Let's see. Can you advance it by any chance? Oh, there it is. It finally advanced. Thank you. Yeah, the last 2 pages of the book are 7 other amazing facts, and I put those in there as much for the adults as for the children. And I'm going to end this whole talk with one of those. And it's, how did Neanderthals get their name? Well, Joachim Neander was a German theologian in the mid-1600s. And even though he died at the tender age of 25 from tuberculosis, he had written more than 40 hymns and poems for the church, many of which are very popular, sung in churches today. Well, the people loved him, and they wanted to name a valley after him. And in German, a valley is a tal, so it was Neanderthal. Well, about 200 years later, in the mid-1800s, workers are digging in the Neanderthal, and they come across some oddly shaped human bones, and they sent those to the local experts of the day, one of whom was Rudolf Virchow, the father of pathology. He'd written more than 2,000 papers on pathology. And of course, he puts them into his frame of reference, pathology, and he says, oh, these were likely a Russian Cossack soldier who had slightly bowed legs. He had rickets, and from the pain of his disease, he frowned a lot, and he caused these big eyebrow ridges. Well, luckily, Darwin's Origin of the Species was published at almost that exact same time, and older discoveries of Neanderthals began to resurface, ones that hadn't been recognized before, and people all of a sudden realized, wow, we didn't used to be the only humans on this world. There were other men here too, and it was a paradigm shift of enormous magnitude. Well, they wanted to try and come up with a name for it, and the earliest suggestion, the leading suggestion, was Homo stupidus, which I think says a lot about Homo sapien arrogance. But luckily, one of my kind of people, a geologist, William King, suggested the name Homo neanderthalensis, and they settled on that. Well, that's a cool story by itself, but here's the part that can send chills down my spine. The ancient Greek translation of Neander's name means new man. So unknowingly, they named these Valley of the New Man. How ironic, how amazing, how cool is that? Well, that's what I have for you tonight. I hope you'll check out the books back here that we have. They're selling for less than you'd pay on Amazon. And also, please check out my paleoanthropology posts on Facebook at author Neil Bockoven, seen by 5 million followers weekly. Two of the last 3 reached over 6 million. And also, please check out Paleo Human Mysteries. I've got 4 videos out already with mine. They're about 12 minutes long. They're funny, and they have mind-blowing facts in them, just stuff that is hard to imagine. And I've got the newest one coming out, a 5th, probably in a couple of weeks, and it's on cave art. So I'll have a couple more coming out on cave art, and then 2 real creepy ones coming out about our cannibalistic human past. So I hope you'll check those out, and I'd be glad to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, for a fantastic talk. While we let Neil take a drink here, quick reminder to everyone on our in-person audience, we're going to be bringing a microphone around. Sammy, up there in the red coat, can bring that around. Please do use that microphone to ask your question. Not only will it help Neil to hear that, but it will also help our online viewers to hear your question as well. And it looks like we've got one ready to go.
Great lecture. Really enjoyed it. Terrific. Can you expound a little bit on von Petzinger's work, why she thinks there are these similarities in symbols? And also, is it like a precursor to cuneiform or numbers?
You're talking about Genevieve von Petzinger? Why she thinks what now, please?
Does she think the symbols that are recurring through caves around the world, is that a precursor to cuneiform, to numbers? Any theories on what she's finding?
She's written a very good book. I'd recommend her book. And she's actually a reviewer of my current cave art video coming out soon. I don't think there's a lot of, other than what Ben Bacon has told us, I don't think we've made a lot of progress in knowing what these symbols mean, other than what they might mean. And I would guess that some of them are hunting instructions. Some of them might be north, south, east, west, something of that nature. But it's going to be unlikely that we ever find a Rosetta Stone or anything of that nature. So good question. Thanks.
Thank you. Here's one from our online audience, so Sammy doesn't have to run at top speed across there with the microphone. Virginia has a 2-part question. Wondering if there's cave art in Asia that's comparable to what we see in Europe, and how cave art can be dated without damaging it.
Yeah, 2 good questions. There's undoubtedly a lot of cave art in Asia. I mentioned the Indonesian art. That's the oldest art we know of Homo sapiens. I don't think it's been explored as aggressively as the areas in Europe. So I would expect more and more to be showing up every year. As far as, what was the second part of that question?
And how can we date cave art and still protect it?
That's very cool stuff. Just lately, there's been a new breakthrough. But bottom line, first answer the question. They can date the crusts of calcification that overlie the pictures. And lately, it's become so accurate that in Mandarin Cave, some of you may that follow this kind of subject, they found evidence of 5 different levels, Neanderthal, 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 unknown, and Neanderthal. Well, this unknown one, they have done more excavation there and determined that that was a Homo sapien tooth that they found, and that the very, very different lithic chips, which are very much smaller than the below and above levels, almost certainly are Homo sapien and tied to a similar kind of lithic industry from Lebanon. So it's almost certain that humans were in Mandarin Cave about 52,000 years ago, but they didn't last long. By looking at, I'm probably going to get the pronunciation of this wrong, but it's something on the order of fulgination, FUL something. They can look at the crust of calcite and see different cave fires showing up in the crusts, and they date that humans were only in Mandarin Cave for, this blows my mind, for 40 years. That's how the level of detail that they can now get on some of these dating things. So, and they've got other techniques as well. They can date sand grains that have been buried for a long time, luminescence. They use potassium, carbon-14. That's upper range is about 50,000 years ago. And there's a number of other ones, but those are the big ones.
Hi. Could you talk a little bit more about the cave that you were showing us toward the beginning in Alabama, where you couldn't see the image until they had done the photographic enhancement? What prompted them to actually know to do that?
Well, I think you can see a few faint engravings better than others, but yeah, that's they have compared the art there with Woodlands style pottery, and in my video coming out, you'll see a lot of discussion of that and some comparisons there. Yeah, I don't really know much more about it other than the cave is I just don't think it's going to be a big tourist attraction, because for people to lie on their backs with a cave 2 feet above them, looking at these faint engravings, I'm not sure we're ever going to. It's probably safer from human destruction than many of the caves. I just heard that, for instance, at Lascaux, that the caves there have been degraded about 90% because we let too many people in, and their breath exhalations started mold and white crystallization of gunk on them, and they're just ruined. What's good is they built these replica caves, Lascaux 2, which is what I visited, that are down to the millimeter, and Chauvet just unveiled a $62 million replica cave for it. So, but again, I can't really get much further on your question than that. I don't know.
All right. While we bring that mic over for you, we've got another online question from what I'm thinking is S. Lynn Lee, but that could be wrong. It might be Slyn Lee for all I know. I understand that it is an unanswerable question, but evidence suggests that humans throughout time have needed art. And why do you think that may be true?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It does boggle the mind that these people were in a daily struggle just for survival, just to get enough food, or just to avoid a famine this coming winter, and to take time to put a handprint up there or to draw a beautiful painting. It's possible they were teaching their young hunting techniques or how to recognize animals or which ones were dangerous and which weren't. It's possible that they were tying them to star charts and so forth. There's probably some truth in all those. It's possible they were talking about hunting instructions of 4 months until the good times roll, and or that go north for the best hunting site. It's exciting to me that we've made as much progress. It looked hopeless to start with, but this past year we made a major breakthrough. We got to take the victory, and so there is progress being made. But that's a good question. I don't know that we'll ever know much more than we'll scratch the surface on knowing what these symbols mean.
Yeah, so you mentioned some of the caves in Europe and that the art was Neanderthal art. How do we know that those were made by Neanderthals and not Homo sapiens? Or how do you know other art was made by Homo sapiens and not Neanderthals?
And
Or other homo,
And there's a question about that in some cases, but where a cave, one of those Neanderthal images came from Parsiga Cave and or Parsiega Cave, and Neanderthals were the only occupants ever in that cave. So that to me is a pretty clear. Now, if there were art in the Mandarin Cave where they had Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, that would be more problematic. But a lot of it's timing and the artifacts that we find in that area at that time, Brian. That's the bulk of how we know.
Looking at some of the really detailed artwork, like the horses and the bison and whatever those were, they were beautiful. I could never draw something like that, not without a lot of practice. So I guess I'm wondering, are there like practice caves that we just don't get to see because they're not as nice? Or like, where did these people get the skills that they had?
That is a very good question. And there are more rudimentary images. I mean, we probably focus on the best ones, don't we? But bottom line is I don't see a lot of practicing going on. I think some of these people were scratching on shale, flat pieces of shale and sort of getting an idea of drawing in the dirt before they started. And, but they are just, some of it is just amazingly done. It's just brilliant artistic talent. And that goes again to, it overturned, Chauvet overturned theories that art developed and got more sophisticated through time. It's pretty clear that there were highs and lows all through prehistory. And there's definitely some that are more breathtaking than others.
Got a question. So there was one part of your talk where you were comparing, if I remember correctly, much of the art found in Europe to the art that had been found in Australia.
Yeah.
You were talking about the almost complete lack of human figures in one part of the world versus a lot of human figures in the Australian cave art.
Yeah.
And I was curious, one, if you could speak a little bit more on theories of why that difference is specifically about humans, because like the fish thing kind of makes sense. If you don't live near fish, you're not going to draw the fish. But if all of these ancient people were living near other people, why are we only seeing those figures in one part of the world? And I kind of relatedly, in the slide you put up of the Australian art where you had a number of images of mostly human figures, there was one image in the bottom right of your slide that to my eyes immediately looked like a woman giving birth.
Yeah.
And I was really curious if you could talk about that image specifically.
Yeah. The answer is, it's a great question. And the answer is, I don't think anybody knows a whole lot, but we can make a few statements about it. And to me, it's pretty clear if you're leaving out, if you're talking about stars and Pleiades and so forth, but you're leaving out images of the moon and the sun, they must have either a special place in your world, in your religion or your belief system, that maybe it was taboo to show pictures of humans for some of these cultures, or show pictures of the sun. And in Australia, that obviously wasn't the case. So, and that certainly was a woman, and she may have been giving birth, as you mentioned. And of course, that would be a big cultural event to the indigenous Australians, and they captured important events and cultural interactions with other humans and important animals in their artwork. But again, we're left wondering about and perplexed about all these. Why didn't they have pictures of the moon in there? I mean, that's such an easy thing to do, and we see it on so many of our, a crescent moon or a full moon. It's just. And I'm sure they told time back in the day by saying, when the moon gets full, in our words, in 2 weeks, when the moon gets full, we'll be there. But, and maybe because of that, it was, again, sacred or special, and they didn't show it. So very perplexing.
Thinking about the Pleiades constellation, and kind of seeing that all over, not all over the world, but kind of widespread throughout a bunch of different caves. Are there any other constellations or like star-like figures that we've seen or that we maybe think are constellations that have been discovered?
Well, according to Sweatman and Combs, yes. But I'm not sure that a whole lot of people have been won over to their line of thinking that many of the Lascaux and images elsewhere show not only Pleiades and Taurus, but other constellations. I'm not sure a whole lot of anthropologists have signed on to that yet. But certainly Taurus the bull, I'm convinced of that. I thought it was pretty powerful, pretty persuasive evidence. And the night sky was all they looked at before they fell asleep for an hour or 2 or 3 every night. And their night sky was so much brighter with so many more visible stars than we see, that it was important to them, and that they made connections that we would never make, just because we never see them because of the city lights and so forth. But it's I think you're going to find that, yes, there are some other constellations there, but I mean, if you have one, you're likely to have some others, but I don't think a persuasive case has been made as to which ones yet.
With like art history in general, what do people consider is coming next after like cave painting and Paleolithic art?
What came next?
Yeah, like if when people put together a timeline of Homo sapien art, is there like a direct connection between this and then like early civilization art?
Well, let me answer that question a little bit from a different angle. I just put out a post less than a month ago about prehistoric cave motion pictures. And some of it related to Chauvet and the superimposed images there that in a flickering light would look like an animal perhaps charging, or the flickering light across the 7 horns of the bull. You might see the bull or a rhino moving. There's a guy named Mark Azema who has studied cave art specifically with regard to images that show motion. And he's done it for about 20 years now and written a number of papers. And he says that Lascaux has the most of those kind of images. I would have expected it to be Chauvet, but by the way, think about this. Chauvet is about twice as old, is over twice as old as Lascaux, and yet their artwork was at least as good. So that's sort of mind blowing by itself. But getting back, recently they have found little disc shaped bone discs with a hole in the middle that show images of, for instance, an antelope on one side, and most of them have a different image on the backside, like a seated, a lying down antelope. And they used to think these were buttons, but what they found is that you can run a thread through there, and you can pull the thread back and forth, and the thing will spin around, and it'll look like an antelope running and jumping and running and jumping and running and jumping. And it's the first, that and some of the images I showed, you know, the show motion, they consider the earliest cave motion pictures. So really, really cool stuff. And again, that's something that only recently we've recognized probably aren't buttons, but probably were the oldest toys or human things that sort of kept their mind off their problems, you know. So very cool stuff. So check out that Paleo, my author Neil Bockoven Facebook page, and you'll find that on there. Good stuff.
We've got a question over here on your right, Amy.
Yes.
Could you give us some sense of the size in these caves, of how large those images were?
How large the images were, or the
Yeah.
caves?
No, the images themselves.
Oh, the images.
Were they little, were they-
Well, I think there's a bull image at Lascaux that is like 3 meters in length. It's very sizable, and it's bigger than an average bull was. And but a lot of the images are pretty much life-sized, and then of course that northern Alabama had an 11-foot image. I think it was of one of those human-like figures in regalia. So that's probably double the size of what a human was at the time. So that answer your question? Yeah, thanks.
So with the one in Alabama that was not really visible without those imaging techniques. So do you think there might be a lot other ones like that where might not look like anything's there, but we might be able to see that? And you think that, and could potentially eventually at some point the ones that have been lost to sea level rise be like image in a similar process?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, you know, I just watched an art show where a painting that was done by some Rembrandt kind of person, they found that when they x-rayed it, they found there was a whole head of a person that had been blocked out, and he didn't make the cut. So I'm wondering if using some of these techniques, like photogrammetry or even x-rays or whatever, that we're going to find images that we just never knew were there. And it's fascinating to think about. And it's really exciting too, because it broadens the field of possibilities for us of where we might find new art, right in amongst the other art. So exciting stuff. Hope that answered the question. Yes.
Here, I've got a microphone.
And carvings on the side of cliffs. Not necessarily in caves. Do you see that in Europe?
Yeah.
At the same age that you're talking about?
Oh, do we?
Yeah.
Have the same age? Not very often. I was just out in Tucson, Arizona, and a guy has taken me there twice now. There are petroglyphs there that have been dated to about 800 years ago, and they are just world class. I mean, you should build a park around this stuff, and there should be guards and everything. But I'm worried. They're actually, the guy showed me where actually one petroglyph had been chipped out and taken by, for lack of a better word, pot hunter. You know, but I'm worried about how some of this just outstanding art is going to disappear on us if we're not careful. But most of that is younger. It's in the 800 to maybe 1500-year-old range.
I have one question similar to
I'm going to
question
stand over
from
here
there.
out of the light.
I was wondering, is there much cave art been found in like Turkey? In the country of Turkey, has there been much? Because his question made me think of, you know, the progression of art of would there have been similar stuff in Turkey, and would that progress to the kind of images we see at like Göbekli Tepe?
Göbekli Tepe. Yeah. That is that's a pretty cool question, because think Lascaux is 17,000 years and Göbekli Tepe is about 11,000 years. So it's not that much different in time. And they were not only drawing and carving images, but they were erecting these stone pillars and amazing centers. I mean, dozens of them, really. You've probably read about those, but they are just, it's a place on my bucket list for sure. And I used to live in Turkey, by the way, but that was long before they found those. And but the timing, we're gradually getting a continuum of art that doesn't just jump from 20,000 to 5,000 years ago with a big space in between. We're seeing a lot of this get closer together.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
I love talking about this stuff.
Yes, don't be shy.
My friends say, don't get him started. Oops, too late.
Got one over here.
Okay, I guess I have two questions. So the first, just to clarify, you mentioned that a lot of these caves where we find the art, people weren't living there.
But say what?
You said the people weren't living there. You would say
That
maybe shamans.
does seem to be at least as common as not.
And then, okay, I'm trying to remember something you mentioned earlier, but you said the one woman, she has this hypothesis that a lot of the images in was it one cave or a series of caves sort of tell a story? She was saying it was almost like a book.
Oh, Dr. Carolyn Boyd, in the Trans-Pecos, Texas area, the White Shaman mural and all those kind of things. Yeah. Colorful images of people and symbols in hundreds of caves there. And she thinks a bunch of them were made at the exact same time. And she has some evidence for that, so. That's another place on my bucket list. That's near to where I live, so that's likely to make the cut. So.
Are you aware if there's been any cave paintings or drawings found in this area in like Western Pennsylvania or the surrounding areas?
Let me think about that. I can't think of any. You've got some amazing archaeological sites nearby. You probably know about Meadowcroft and some of those things, but that, by the way, pushed the timing of human migration into this new world back way farther than they used to think. However, now it's even farther back than that. Some of you may have seen the footprints found in New Mexico that had seeds in them that dated to 23,000 years ago. So very, very clear human footprints. And recent article just came out where a giant sloth footprints had little kids' footprints playing in the puddles. And but still, we were definitely here in the Americas at least 23,000 years ago. And but I don't know of any art in Pennsylvania. I'm sure there's some, but not that I know of.
The only ancient art that I know about are petroglyphs along the Allegheny River and in riverside stones, and they're not nearly as ancient as many of the things that you showed in other places. I'm I'm wondering what are your favorite one or two learnings from DNA evidence?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Well, I tell you what, I didn't plan to write a book. And I just loved the research. I was doing research. I was getting stacks of research and finding out all these amazing things. My wife's name is Denise, and I found out about Denisovans, and they were even more primitive than Neanderthals, and I loved telling her that. That is probably the number one thing. And then another thing that I found out, and some of these things show up in my videos, we got proclivities. Just about everybody in here has probably about 2% Neanderthal genes in their bodies. And from our Neanderthal genes, we got proclivities that gave us better immune systems. But with those better immune systems came problems like higher chances for lupus, for Crohn's disease. Whoa, I have Crohn's disease. That blew my mind, thinking that I may have gotten Crohn's disease from my great-great-great-great-grandfather Og, on the Neanderthal side. So it was things like that. Oh, and then another thing, Jean Aul, her main characters in Clan of the Cape Bear, Isla, was played by Daryl Hannah, right? Blonde, blue-eyed, fair skin, and the Neanderthals were stooped and darker, and it turns out the racial roles were reversed. We were freshly out of Africa. We had the much darker skin than Neanderthals did. Neanderthals were quite variable, but they almost certainly had lighter skin than we did. And so it was things like that that made me think, there is so much cool stuff going on. We're learning so much that I bet there's a book to be written in about this. And I started typing on my typewriter, and about 3 months in, my wife looks at me and says, "What are you doing over there?" And I said, I don't want to talk about it right now. I want to see where this goes. And about 9 or 10 months of typing, and I had my first rough draft, and that's how that book got started, really. So I didn't expect to write it. It was just stemmed from all the cool research that I thought people should know about. So one more thing about the DNA question. Okay, let me make sure I get this right. Thomas Higham is one of the key investigators, and he's got a book out called The World Before Us. Great book. And he talks about one of his graduate students was looking in Denisova Cave. That's where the Denisovans were first found. They found 3 teeth and a finger bone that size, just that little tiny piece of finger bone. And from that one little finger bone, the teeth were no good as far as DNA, but from that one little finger bone, they got the DNA of Denisovans defined. And we not only found out that here was a whole new human species we knew nothing about, nothing. We didn't even know they'd been around. But this genetics was telling us, wow, there's a whole species here that we didn't know about. But get this, Denisovans have contributed more to the human Homo sapien genome, at least in Southeast Asia, than Neanderthals have anywhere. And we knew nothing about them back in 2010. So it's those kind of mind-blowing discoveries that, and that was Svante Pabo, by the way, who just won the Nobel Prize. And he was, by the way, the first guy to get the Denisovan genome and the Neanderthal genome. So one guy got both of those and won the Nobel Prize for it. Thanks for asking that question. I didn't plant that question, I promise.
You mentioned cannibalism in our
Yes.
past. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Well, one of my books is called The People Eaters. So I get that question a lot. Were Neanderthals really cannibals? And the short answer is yes, a fair percentage of them were. And our friend Svante Pabo has a quote where he says, evidence of bones broken for their marrow and gnaw marks and cut marks on human bones are typical of many, probably most Neanderthal sites. So it wasn't uncommon. I'm not saying it was pervasive, but it wasn't uncommon. And so that is part of the background of the People Eaters book. I won't spill the beans too much more on that one, but yeah, and cannibalism dates back all the way to some 1.4 million year old human bones found by Mary Leakey in 1972 weren't recognized as far as having evidence of cannibalism, but they were just looked at recently. And a woman, I forgot her name, noted that there were 14 cut marks on the bone made by a flint blade that show at least defleshing and probable cannibalism that date back 1.4 million years. So that's shows that cannibalism was pretty pervasive all through our history. By the way, in my upcoming video, who do you think holds the title for the most prolific cannibal of all time? Rate Udre, who was a Fijian tribal chief. There's pretty good evidence that he ate portions of 972 people. He holds the record.
Let's hope no one breaks that record anytime soon. Last call for questions from the audience. Do we have anyone else who'd like to ask anything? Going once, going twice.
Well, thank you so much for being a great audience and letting me talk about a subject I love talking about. So
Thank you for joining us tonight, Neil. Great round of applause. We really appreciate you joining us here in Pittsburgh. And remember, folks, you can visit the table here. We have signed books. And if there was a question you were too embarrassed to ask in front of everyone, I'm sure you can ask that at the table as well. So next Café Sci is December 4th, and we are still firming up our plans for the speaker on that one, but that will be on our webpage as soon as we get that locked in for you. Yeah, of course, of course. Thanks for joining us tonight, everybody. Please do travel safely, and we will see you here with your good friends or your worst enemies next month for Café Sci. Thank you.
Please remember to take your trash as you're leaving the theater. Thank you.